EmeraldPlanet, as we come to you from Washington, D.C. in the United States and looking at the 143 different nations. And as you know, we're bringing more people in from around the globe using Skype and the internet, real experts that are involved in this whole notion of climate change, alternative energy production, and the many ways of bringing the technologies, the services, and the products to be useful for the expanding population around the globe. Right now we're at about 7 billion souls, and they're saying by 2050 we could be at 9 billion plus. And so instead of risking the quality of life, we want to be sure that we have the very resources that are needed, but also to protect the environment at the same time. And so there's this delicate balance between the environment, between the economy, and also the development of civil society. And now we're going to be talking and going to the very cold and expansive Russian Arctic. And we're being taken there by Sara Wheeler, who is the author of the book, The Magnetic North, Notes from the Arctic Circle. And Sara, be sure to remind me at the very end so that we can share with our viewing publics how they can obtain your book. It's very fascinating. I must say I spent a lot of time with it myself the last 2 days. There's much there. So why don't you start off with your passage? We're going to bring up the map of the Russian Arctic North and the Scandinavian countries and talk about that. But won't you read your first passage there about the Russian Federation, the Russian Arctic, and then we'll get into some of the questions that we have.
Yes, I'd love to do that. Russia has more Arctic territory than any other nation. And of course it stretches all the way from Europe to the Pacific, right the way just looking over onto Alaska there. And so there's a massive amount of differential in all that territory. And the bit I'm going to read you is about my experiences in the European Arctic and the White Sea, where I visited a monastery which plays an incredibly important role in Russian history in the White Sea. And I had to catch a little fishing trawler over from the mainland to the island. After 2 hours, perhaps longer, a dark sequence of turrets and domes rose from the distant waves, a low-lying, tightly self-contained silhouette, pulling the currents into its own magnetic field. It seemed wondrous. It must have seemed a miracle to a medieval pilgrim. My companions reached into their string bags for bulky horizon cameras and streamed on deck to start snapping. Between the Karelian coast and what the Russians call the Summer Coast, the islands and islets of the Solovki archipelago lie half a degree south of the Arctic Circle. Although a microclimate sustains cherry trees and cabbages, as well as 600 lakes and swamps, Solovki winters are still long, dark, and brutal. On Big Solovki, where we disembarked, 1,000 civilians inured to hardship live alongside the Holy Fathers, servicing the pilgrim trade, harvesting salt, and struggling to maintain a power supply. Beyond the coastal sorrel and Siberian cedars, violet mists curled through the larches, the scent of hackberries cut the air, and lakes shone through vertical slits between the forest trunks. The ubiquitous dun-coloured mud of the north spread inland in what Dostoevsky called a sort of pea jelly. My companions from the ferry vanished to a hostel in the forest, so I had lunch alone in my hotel. The waiter, a youth in an embroidered tunic, understood instinctively that there was no point wasting time with incomprehensible menus. Without a word, he brought a dish of minced perch and salted boletus mushrooms, and he watched me as I ate. I had never had a better lunch, and told him so, the phrases translated by my empty dish.
Well, I tell you, it's just the views there are just absolutely marvelous, and it's hard to imagine something as isolated, as brutal, but yet as beautiful as this whole area of the Russian Arctic. And yet at the same time, Russia shares that vast area with a number of Scandinavian countries. And in your travels there, what did you see this balance between the Russian Arctic or the Russian state and the other Scandinavian countries that share this vast territory?
Well, it's much better than it used to be. The area you're referring to, Sam, is what we know as Lapland. It's Sami country. Sami is another word for Lapps. And they're indigenous peoples of the Arctic, one of many, many groups of indigenous Arctic peoples. They used to roam all the way across that arc of the Arctic, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. Karelia is the part of Russia, herding their reindeer. They were nomadic peoples and they herded reindeer. Some of them hunted marine mammals. And they had a culture and a language and a unique set of beliefs and values. And really had been travelling freely in that region until the communist period, when, of course, the portcullis came down and one lot was separated from the other. And then during the Second War, called upon to fight one another and so on and so on. Now the situation is much better, and all the countries, the sovereign countries involved, including Russia, recognise that these peoples kind of have something different from nationality that links them, so they are able to travel on their own papers without proper passports across that arc.
Well, I think that's fantastic. You know, many of us really understand this goes back to the Gulag Archipelago, and many other books have been written about this area, and we understand this relationship of the Arctic Circle and Siberia, but yet you spent much time in the European sector of Russia, because it is such a vast country. And so what are the connections of the European Russians to the Arctic that may be unique or different than those that actually live and have settled in Siberia itself?
Okay, well, let me mention, first of all, you mentioned the Gulag Archipelago, and Solzhenitsyn was, in fact, on that monastic island that I mentioned on Solovki, and he writes about it before he was sent further inland elsewhere in the Arctic. In fact, the first Gulag in 1921 was founded on Solovki. As for what the connections are and how they're maintained now, I think that, I mean, there are many economic links, and certainly the Finns and the Russians have had a very complex history. They share a border, of course, which now is much more harmonious. And Russia now, of course, is desperate to be part of Europe, and to a certain extent is thought of as part of Europe. I believe they send singers to the Eurovision Song Contest. And they want to kind of have equal links on either side of this enormous territory. And I think that many of us actually feel that Russia is more European than it used to be. I feel that, or maybe it's always been so, but now we can recognise it as such. And certainly in the Arctic lands, they can use this sort of cultural and racial unity that they have, Russian Lapps and Swedish Lapps, for example, to strengthen those ties.
Yeah, when I was just last week at the United Nations for the United Nations Conference on Indigenous Peoples, we're working in the South Pacific, which is totally different than what we're talking about as far as the Arctic zone, but they had a number of the peoples, Lapps there, that actually were from 3 different countries, and they were meeting as a group to talk about how they were going to develop their lands in the Arctic zone across, Finland, Sweden, and Russia. And so it was interesting to see they just came together on their own there at the United Nations, and they had this giant meeting that was going on throughout the week. So what you're saying is going across all these different cultural and linguistic groups is a way to kind of cut through some of the strata between governments. Sometimes is very harsh and is devoid of reality. Russia just sent some mini subs in there and planted some Russian flags on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean to stake their claims and say, hey, we're here, we're first, and all you others look out. Do you think Russia is going to be overly aggressive as far as staking and protecting its claims to the riches of the Arctic zone? Or do you think this level of trust and communications and sharing across these various nation states of Scandinavia and, of course, the United States, Denmark, and others is going to prevail?
I think somewhere between the two, actually, Sam. The episode you're referring to is when Mr. Chingarov, a Russian deputy in Parliament in the Duma, went down in a submarine and got to exactly underneath the ice at 90 degrees north and hammered in a Russian flag to show how fantastically Russian it was. Well, that was a bit of a joke. It's posturing, it's barnstorming. I don't think anybody really minds that much. Russia is trying very hard to show how very Russian the Arctic is. But I don't think it's going to be overly aggressive, because Canada is actually trying really hard to show how Canadian the Arctic is. America doesn't do too badly in showing how their bit of Alaska is very American. We can't do much sitting here in London because we don't actually have any Arctic territory. But the Scandinavian countries too are pretty key. The race for hydrocarbons is on, so we've all got a lot at stake, and we all want to prove that it's ours, that bit up there. But actually, all this is governed, as you know, Sam, by the International Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is a UN organisation, and basically you only own the territory so far as your continental shelf extends. Beyond that, it's not owned. So the Arctic Ocean, you have to prove that your country's continental shelf extends, and then you own the land, and therefore the mineral rights to everything that's under the ocean there. Beyond that, you don't. Well, what that means, of course, is that everybody's got a lot of seabed geologists up there as we speak, proving how every continental shelf, of course, extends for forever and ever and ever. But I believe these things are going to be worked out peaceably. Russia certainly isn't the only country being aggressive about it, but I think that there are ways to work these things out, and it's a writer's duty to have hope, and I do have hope.
Sarah, we have about 1 minute left. I want to leave with this impression, the globe here, as far as the Arctic zone. And at the same time, in about 30 seconds, what would be kind of the overarching theme or idea you would like to leave with our audience from around the globe?
I would say that the Arctic is simultaneously a beautiful and a terrifying place, and that's a bit of a metaphor for life itself. And I think that it is important to have hope. I have hope, and I think we must carry in our own minds that sort of image of a gleaming white wonderland that we have to both preserve, but we also have to preserve ourselves. So we have to do the next right thing by the Arctic for generations to come.
How can folks obtain your book? Can we share that?
It's not difficult. You can get it off Amazon.com.
Okay, we're losing Sarah because we're leaving you now. Thank you for being with us as we look at the Arctic zone and the changes going there from climate change. And thank you for being with us as we create the Emerald Planet.